all of a sudden I started to lose my hearing and my vision went black and white. My mother said that my lips had turned completely white, that my face had just lost any color at all. So today we are going to be talking about my labor story. That was highly requested from a couple of the people that have been watching. Just want to talk about how Isla was brought into the world. I'll start with the day before I had her, which was when my contractions started. The day before that, I had just had a cervical check and I was only a fingertip dilated and I wasn't that much effaced. They were going to have me do a 24-hour urine sample the following day because they were watching me for preeclampsia. I had a non-fetal stress test as well that day because they were noticing that my levels were increasing of I think it's protein that's in your urine, and my blood pressure was very high, and I also had pitting edema. So I had all of those things, and then the following day at 4 a.m. I ended up having contractions. My contractions were about 6 to 7 minutes apart. I was watching them with this app that I had used my whole entire pregnancy. So anytime that I had a contraction, I would hold down the button and I would hit the button again when my contraction stopped. So that's how I knew that they were about 6 to 7 minutes apart. And that went on for about an hour. I had called my on-call doctor around 5 a.m. just to say, hey, I'm thinking that I'm having contractions and this is how far along they are, or how far apart they are. And he said, yeah, he's like, you're only 38 weeks. I really don't think that you're going into labor this early. He said, give it another hour. And if you have more contractions and they get closer, he was like, then give me another call. So I start walking, I'm going up and down the stairs because at this point I was so ready to have her because of all the issues that I had been having leading up to this point. I was swollen, my blood pressure was very high, I was very, very tired and retaining a lot of water. So I was doing everything to keep those contractions going compared to just laying in bed. So I kept walking up and down the stairs. I think I did laps around the coffee table. So I ended up letting another hour go by and I was watching my contractions and they got a little bit closer, maybe about 5 minutes apart. So I woke up my husband and told him that I'm pretty sure I'm going into labor, and I gave my on-call doctor a call. So I called him again and told him how far apart my contractions were, and he said, okay, go ahead and come in. So we started packing up the car. I had luckily already packed my hospital bag and our overnight stay bags as well. I loaded all of that up into the car, and I texted my mom and we texted his mom and just told them that we were on our way to the hospital and that they were going to watch me, that I think that I'm going into labor. So we throw everything into the car. I don't even think to eat or do anything. I brought my makeup along with me as if I was really going to take the time to do that. But I brought my makeup with me. We ended up getting to the hospital around 7. And they checked me in and they put me in a triage room. So they strapped me up, started watching my contractions, and they were pretty consistent, still about 5 minutes apart. From 7 to, let's say, about 11, they just kept watching me. And around 11 o'clock, they told me to do some walking because my contractions weren't getting any closer. I walked for about an hour and I just did laps around like the recovery area, and then I went back to my room and I just waited for the doctor to come in. But because I didn't want my contractions to slow down, I kept walking in the room, and every time a nurse would peek her head in, I'd sit down because I was just embarrassed, I guess. I just knew, I kept telling my mom that if I was to get sent home that I'm pretty sure I would start crying, because at that point I was so ready to have Isla and my body had just had enough that I said, if they don't keep me with how consistent my contractions are, I'm going to get upset. My doctor ended up coming in at around 12 and he checked to see how far dilated I was. At that point, I was 4 centimeters dilated and 80% effaced. I remember sitting down on the hospital bed and he asked the nurse to get the, I think it's like a hook, and he broke my water. So I was not expecting that. When he broke my water, I actually giggled, and he said that that was the strangest reaction that he had ever had to breaking somebody's water. My water broke on the bed, and they said, okay, go ahead, get yourself cleaned up, grab all of your things, and we're gonna move you to the labor and delivery room. So I actually had the last room available. I guess everybody was having their babies that day. So luckily I got the last room. And I remember walking to the bathroom to go and collect my things, and as I got up, I just kept leaking all over the floor, and my poor husband was following behind me with a washcloth, just wiping up everything and making sure that I was okay. So I went and I changed. They gave me like the mesh underwear with like the huge pad, you know, the grandma diaper. And they had me walk to my labor and delivery room. At that point, my contractions started becoming more consistent. I remember texting my mom and my mother-in-law, telling them to come to the hospital, that they just broke my water. I told the nurse that it was easier for me to walk while dealing with my contractions than sitting down. For me, it was easier to cope with the pain if I was moving around compared to just sitting. So she had to hook up this monitor on my belly that made it easier for me to walk around and still keep track of my contractions as well as her heartbeat. It was a little more complicated, and it took a lot of time for her to do that. So about an hour went by while she was getting that ready, and they were trying to get my IV put in, but I was so dehydrated from not eating or drinking anything that they had a very hard time trying to get the IV in. So they spent about 30 minutes trying to get it in, and then she had to go through, I think she went on one hand and then tried the other, and then finally got my IV in. And I don't know if any of you know this, but you cannot get your epidural until you have a bag of fluids. In my case, I tested positive for strep B, so they have to give you antibiotics before you can get your fluids. Once they got the IV in, I started my fluids, and then a nurse ended up coming in and putting on the fluids, or putting in the antibiotic for my strep B. So by that point, my contractions were very consistent, probably about maybe 3 minutes apart or so, and I just remember being in so much pain. Every time I knew a contraction was coming along, when her heartbeat would increase, and my contractions were lasting for about maybe a minute and a half to 2 minutes. So I had to wait to get my antibiotics, and when the antibiotic bag was put on with my fluids, it slowed down everything. So it took maybe about an hour and a half for me to get both my antibiotics and my fluid. So as soon as that fluid was up, we ended up calling the nurse, and I said, I'm ready for my epidural. Of course, the anesthesiologist was busy because, like I said, everybody was having their babies that day. So he ended up coming in maybe about 10 or 15 minutes later, and I got my epidural. That was probably the scariest part for me, just because with how strong my contractions were, it was very hard for me to sit still, and that is a major thing for you to do when you were getting your epidural. You have to stay still. So he ended up coming in, and he was explaining to me. He said, you know, I can't remember the things that they want you to watch for. I think it's like if you get lightheaded, let him know that. And I didn't really have any symptoms when he went to put in my epidural. It actually did not hurt at all, and it went very smoothly. So they give you half of it just to see if you have any of the side effects, and then they give you the rest of it, and then make sure that you are sitting up once you're done. So my epidural went well. I went and I laid back, and my mom and my mother-in-law came back into the room. All of a sudden, I started to lose my hearing, and my vision went black and white. My mother said that my lips had turned completely white, that my face had just lost any color at all. Luckily at that time, the nurses and the doctor had just walked in, and the doctor had said her blood pressure had bottomed out. We need to give her something to compensate for that. They ended up putting something to compensate my drop in blood pressure, to increase it in my IV, and once they gave me that, I felt so much better. But between the epidural, the medication to increase my blood pressure, I had gotten extremely nauseous. I was very, very dizzy, and the nurses kept telling me to try and get some rest, which is very hard. It's kind of like when you've had a little bit too much to drink and you go and close your eyes and the room feels like it's spinning, and I really could not get any rest. So I think at that point they had checked me. Once I got my epidural, I was about 5 or 6 centimeters dilated, and I was still about the same amount effaced. I think around that time, I got my epidural, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 o'clock. Time kept going by, and I was just relaxing a little bit. Maybe about 2 hours, 3 hours later, I started to be able to feel my contractions. The right side of my body was somewhat numb, but I could feel the contractions on that side. And when I called the nurse to tell her, they said that was pretty common, and that they wanted me to be able to feel my contractions, because when it came time to push, they want you to know when you're having a contraction so you can push along with the contraction. I was like, okay, you know, the pain was bearable. It wasn't too bad. Nothing compared to before I had my epidural. So I was like, okay, you know, I said, that's fine. A couple hours goes by, and the pain starts to increase, and I call my nurse and I say, I think I need more epidural. So they administered a little more, but they didn't want to do anything too crazy because of the reaction that I had already had with my blood pressure. I ended up just waiting around. At that point, my husband had some food, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law had some food as well, and they kept coming in and out to check me and make sure that I was doing okay. I think I had a couple ice chips. Towards the end of my pregnancy, I was so addicted to ice. I was going to Sonic every day to get a slushie, and I would just suck all of the flavoring out of it and then just start eating the ice after. I'd get like the largest possible size, and I think I'd get about 1 or 2 of those a day. And I was even eating popsicles, like I think they're like the rocket pops, I think is what they're called, like the red, white, and blue ones. So I was eating those every day too. Anyway, so I was eating some ice, and I think it was around 11 or so that they checked me, maybe 11 or 12, and they checked me, and my contractions were still, they were starting to get stronger even with the extra epidural administered. And I remember calling in my nurse because I wanted to be checked, because things just felt like it was like they were progressing a lot. And I called my nurse and I said, the pain is getting pretty rough. And they checked me, and at that point I think it was about 9 centimeters dilated. She told me to give it another hour, and at that point that they would check me. So that whole hour, I remember, I think my mother and father-in-law had left the room just to go walk around the hospital for a little bit, and my husband was taking a nap because, like I said, it was around 11 or 12 o'clock at night. I just remember every single contraction hitting me, and I just had to close my eyes and hold my breath because I had already had my epidural. I couldn't walk around any, and I was just whimpering in pain. It was getting to the point that it was becoming very intense for me, and I just wanted to keep calling the nurse to have her come in and check me to see if it was time to push. And my mom was standing next to me trying to get my mind off of things. So I watched TV for a little bit just to see if I could distract myself, but at that point there was no distracting me. My mom, this was around maybe 12:45 or so, was like, don't hit that button. I know you want to hit that button very badly, but don't do it. And she ended up hovering her hand over it's like the little remote that you have to call your nurse, and she accidentally hit the nurse call button. So she called them, and luckily she did, because when the nurse checked me, I was ready to start pushing. We woke up my husband because he was taking a nap. My mom went out to the waiting room to wait with my mother and father-in-law, and the nurses came in and started getting me prepped and ready to get my feet in the stirrups and get me ready to start pushing. And once everybody was in there and everything was set up, I started to push. I think I started pushing around 1 a.m. I remember my husband holding one of my legs and a nurse holding the other, and then they had me hold my legs as well to kind of bring them up to my chest and just give me extra strength to push. And I remember my first push, I had no idea what I was doing. I was pushing and I didn't know where to push because they don't really explain to you how to push, you just push. So really the best way to explain how to push during labor is kind of like you're taking a poop. So you are pushing with everything down in that area, and the first time I did not push that way. I realized that shortly after, that I just felt like I wasn't making any progress. So when the next contraction came along, I pushed the right way, and they have you hold your breath as you're pushing, and that allows you to use up all of your energy. So you're using everything in you and you're pushing, and I pushed. I always thought that I was going to be a very quiet pusher, that I wasn't going to be very loud. Literally, I can compare my pushing to Knocked Up. If you have seen that part in the movie where she's pushing and she's screaming. And I wasn't that loud, but I was using a lot of energy, and at that point I had not slept any, so I had been up since 4 a.m. the day before, and we're already coming up at 1 o'clock in the morning. So I had not slept, I have not had anything to eat, my contractions were very painful, and I started to push. At that point, I was realizing that my epidural had almost completely worn off. So I was pushing, and I was pretty much able to feel a good amount of things. So I kept pushing and pushing. Around, I think it was like 1:30 or so, I kept saying, how many more pushes? Where is she? Like, am I doing okay? And the nurse said, just one more, just one more. And I would push, and then she would say, just one more. So I was getting so aggravated. At that point, I was angry pushing, if that is even a thing. And I just kept pushing, and I think it was around 1:49 in the morning was when I had her. Before I had started pushing, the nurses had told me it usually takes about 2 hours for first-time moms to end up pushing out their babies. So for me to have done it in a very short amount of time, I felt very proud of myself. When she came out, they asked me if I wanted to feel her coming out, and I said no thank you. And my husband started crying, and he just kept telling me thank you, and he just couldn't imagine that just watching his daughter be born and how the whole experience went. I think that he was just in complete and utter shock, and so happy to finally have his daughter here. I remember her crying, and they brought her over to go get cleaned up, and my husband went over to go take a picture, and they were cleaning me up, and I had to give birth to the placenta, and I luckily did not have any tears or anything along that line. I'm sure that this is going to be TMI, but hey, it's labor, and eventually some of you girls are going to be going through it yourselves, or I'm sure the ones that have gone through it already have had this experience. I'm not afraid to admit that I pooped on the table. They remove it so quickly that you don't even realize. And also, although I did not tear, I had a lot of pain because of hemorrhoids. Because you're pushing like you're pooping when you're straining, that tends to cause a lot of hemorrhoids, which you also get during pregnancy as well. After they had cleaned me up and everything, I felt like I had to continue pushing. I was just in a lot of pain from the hemorrhoids, and I remember that I was hemorrhaging after, so they also had to give me a shot in my leg to stop the bleeding. At that point, I think I had said that I was in a lot of pain, and I had held Isla for just a little bit of time. The nurses and doctor ended up singing her happy birthday, and she was quiet when everybody was singing, and then once we were done, she started crying again. Like I had said, I was still in a lot of pain, and I had called my nurse over and said, I would like to go to the bathroom, and they said, well, your epidural, you know, I don't think that you should be walking. And I said, I can walk. I said, I was able to feel everything during labor. I'm pretty positive that I can walk from here to the bathroom. So the nurse put her hand out and made me kick my foot up to reach her hand, and I did with both legs, and I swung my legs over and I started to walk over to the bathroom, and I didn't even wait for the nurse because at that point I was just ready to go sit on the toilet and continue pushing because I just was in so much pain. So I was in the bathroom for some time getting cleaned up and just sitting on the toilet to try and relieve some of the pressure that I was having. And at that point, my mom and mother-in-law and father-in-law had come in to see the baby, and my father-in-law was feeding the baby. I ended up coming out of the bathroom, and my mom said that when she looked at me that I looked like I had been hit by a train. My hair was a complete mess. I looked completely exhausted. I went to walk over to the hospital bed, and I went to lay down to try and get some rest since everybody was in there to see the baby. I was very in and out of it because, again, I had had very little sleep, and I had just gone through labor. My husband, ironically enough, had a job interview at like 9 o'clock that morning, so he ended up leaving and going home to get some rest and take care of our dog, and it was just me and my mom. So my mom held the baby and watched her while I tried to get some sleep, and I slept from about 3 or 4 o'clock, and they woke me up at 4. They said, we're going to move you to the recovery room. So they brought me into the recovery room, and at that point I was pretty much awake because I had had my hour of sleep, and I think, as most of you moms know, you just want to spend time with your little one at that point, and sleeping isn't even a priority anymore, especially towards the end of your pregnancy when you get very little sleep anyway, since you're up every 2 hours to pee. I don't even know if I said this, but when Isla was born, she weighed 7 pounds 3 ounces, and she was 19.5 inches long. She had a lot of swelling around the crown of her head because she was partially out during a good amount of the time that I was pushing, so she had a lot of swelling. Other than that, she was 100% healthy, all 10 fingers and 10 toes. They moved me to my recovery room, and she was of course with me, and I think I ended up ordering breakfast. I was starving at that point. I ended up ordering breakfast around 7. My cousin ended up coming in to take photos of Isla. Isla was born with a bit of jaundice, so they were watching her levels. I guess it's bilirubin, so she looked very orange, and they were watching her levels to make sure that they were going down instead of going up. So she they were watching her for that time. My husband ended up coming back after the interview, and my mother and father-in-law came back that morning, and I think my mom ended up going home shortly after because she had been awake for a very long time as well. And we ended up staying because she was born March 7th, and I was admitted Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. I had her Wednesday at 1:49 in the morning, and they kept me from Wednesday to the following day, Thursday, and they wanted to keep me until Friday. And for me, I was ready to go home. The area that they keep the baby in, it's like a plastic bin that has a blanket in it and everything, and I just felt like she wasn't comfortable. I was not comfortable in my hospital bed. I actually ended up sleeping on the couch, or the pull-out couch, because it was more comfortable for me. I was very swollen afterwards from all of the water retention. I actually didn't even fit in the slippers that I brought. I think I stayed in my hospital gown for the whole time until right before I ended up leaving. And but as I was saying, that day they were going to they wanted me to stay until Friday, and I was just like, no, I really would like to go home. And they said, well, as long as you have, if you book an appointment with your pediatrician for the following day, we will gladly let you go home. So I booked an appointment with my pediatrician because they wanted to follow up on her bilirubin levels and make sure again that they were going down. I booked that appointment, and they had to do her hearing test to make sure that she was okay, and I ended up going home, I think that afternoon. As we were leaving, my mother-in-law, mother, and Dan's grandma were there, and I remember them packing up absolutely everything. We asked for extra diapers, extra bottles. I think we took like 7 or 8 hospital blankets. We took shampoo and combs and everything that they offer you for free. 20 of the mesh underwear and the large pads that they have, and the wipes that they give you, and the squirt bottle that they give you to clean yourself with. I loaded up everything. I also wanted to say that another reason why I wanted to go was I just felt so dirty, and I know that a lot of people bring they bring their shower stuff with them to take a shower and do their makeup or do their hair, and I really didn't care, but I felt dirty, and I tried to take a shower that day, and the hospital showers are not very good. I was just ready to go home, take a shower, my own shower, change into my clothes, be comfortable in my home, and get her comfy, and not have to worry about sleeping in a hospital and being checked on every hour to 2 hours. I was taking, I'm trying to remember the name of the medication, but it's kind of like a very strong Advil. I was taking that for pain, especially because of the hemorrhoid problem that I had. I was taking that, and I was also being watched for my hemorrhaging. They will push on your belly to make sure that your uterus is contracting back to size, which is very uncomfortable. So they were checking me that way as well. But anyways, I ended up going home, and we had our first night at home alone with her, and it actually went very well. It wasn't anything crazy. She did better at home than she did in the hospital when it comes to crying and everything. She was more comfortable at home, being able to sleep in her, I think we had her in the bassinet at that point, and we were also co-sleeping only because that seemed to be the only way that she was sleeping. The day that I was getting ready to leave, they offer you a free massage, so I got a massage before I left too. So that was the first time that I had laid on my belly since the first trimester of my pregnancy, so it felt so weird to lay on my belly. I remember that my belly just felt like a deflated balloon. It was just all of this extra skin, and it was just hanging off my body, and it was just so weird to not have my belly anymore. Yeah, so now Isla she'll be 4 months old on the 7th of July. She, the last time that we weighed her, which was about, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks ago, she was about 12 pounds, 4 ounces, and this little booger is 27.5 inches long. So she is currently in 6-month clothing. She still fits in some 3 to 6 month clothing, but a lot of her clothes are 6 months. It is very hard to find her onesies that fit her. She's very long but very skinny, so I'd usually put her in a lot of dresses. Any of the like spaghetti strap things tend to like fall off her shoulders, or they just don't fit her in the chest area right, so she's been in a lot of sleepers or dresses. So she is growing like a weed. Also, all of this hair that she has, she was born with. I like to say that the myth about indigestion, because I had a lot of indigestion towards the end of my pregnancy, which goes right away as soon as you have your baby, but she had so much hair when she was born. I remember when they were checking me during my cervical checks that they kept saying, I can feel her hair, and I was like, oh my goodness. I said that with the amount of indigestion that I had, that she better be born like Rapunzel. She is doing so well now. I think that after I have her 4-month checkup in the middle of July, I'm going to do a 4-month update on her and let you guys know where she is and how she's doing, and we'll talk a little bit about her and the things that I ended up finding out after we had her, and some of the complications that we've had, and some of the milestones that we've met. So I will be doing a video on that at some point. I'm glad that she slept through this whole video. She did a very good job. But I hope that you guys enjoy my labor story, and if there were any questions that I didn't answer, please comment down below and I'll be sure to reply back to those. And I hope that you guys enjoy. Alright, I'll see you guys soon. Bye.